Alright, by now you know that America won the Revolutionary War. But don't get too cocky just yet. You've got to earn that victory. And to do that, let's go back to the beginning. The very first chapter of this war, and see how it all started. Chapter 1, setting the stage. The end of a long war. Alright, let's get into it. So this is a war that has been raging for 6 long years from 1775 to 1781. British troops have fought their way across the colonies and back again. They've taken some big victories and given up some big territory. But throughout it all, they've spent a king's ransom in men and money to keep this war going. And the colonies, though worn out by years of conflict, still haven't broken yet. So with both sides exhausted, and with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory, it's becoming clear that this war can't go on forever. One side or the other is gonna have to come to the negotiating table soon. But the question is, who's gonna be making that decision? And why? And that's what we're gonna find out at the end of this episode. So to really understand this, we need to recap where the two sides left off at the end of the last episode. And to do that, let's once again travel back to September 1781. We'll start on the American side of things, which was pretty bad. At the Battle of Camden, the British under Lord Cornwallis had utterly routed the Americans and sent them fleeing through the Carolinas. In fact, it was so bad for the Americans that General Horatio Gates had actually gotten fired after giving up so much ground without putting up a fight. And his replacement, Major General Nathaniel Greene, had a lot of work to do if he wanted to prevent the British from taking over the South. But while Greene was racing to gather troops to stop Cornwallis, the British commander got word that another large American force was marching towards him, led by Major General Daniel Morgan. Now, most commanders would have probably seen this coming and pulled back before they committed to a battle. But Cornwallis was confident that he could beat Morgan's army in the open field, so he pressed on. And the two armies clashed at the Cowpens on January 1782. Now, I'm not gonna lie, the details of this battle are kind of confusing, so bear with me here. But basically, Morgan set an ambush for Cornwallis's troops, beating them in the open field and driving them back to a fortified area called a But then Morgan stopped attacking and instead allowed the British to regroup and leave. And this right here is where the brilliance of American tactics came in. Because even though they technically didn't win the battle, they inflicted more casualties on the British than they suffered themselves and prevented Cornwallis from regrouping and pursuing them. And with their victory at the Cowpens, Morgan and Greene had essentially turned the tide in the South and forced Cornwallis to retreat northward toward Virginia. And that brings us to the second part of our recap. So while all that was happening in the South, the British were also getting pushed out of the Northeast by the American general, Major General George Washington. He actually began the year 1781 by crossing the Delaware River and capturing the city of Trenton. Then later that year, he teamed up with French forces to trap the British in Yorktown, Virginia. And after a long siege, he forced them to surrender on October 19th, 1781. Now, this victory at Yorktown was pretty decisive, but it wasn't really a turning point in the war. In fact, it was really only a decisive moment for the French, because they had committed a ton of resources to this one battle and needed something big to show for it. But for the Americans, it was just another battle in a long string of conflicts that they were winning, but nothing decisive enough to end the war. That actually happened earlier in the South when Nathaniel Greene beat out Cornwallis at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. It wasn't a decisive victory like Yorktown, but it did weaken Cornwallis enough that he had to withdraw and regroup. And, as we saw, that ended up not going very well for him. So while Cornwallis was technically beaten at Yorktown, he was essentially defeated months earlier at Guilford Courthouse. Alright, so now that we're all caught up, let's get into the good stuff. With Yorktown, the largest battle of the entire war had come to an end, leaving the British in possession of a few small garrison towns along the coast, and the Americans in control of almost all the land in between. And with so little territory remaining, it was clear that Britain had lost the ability to wage war in North America. Even if they wanted to continue fighting, there was simply no way to keep supplies and reinforcements flowing to the colonies. At the same time, the Americans were also completely exhausted by 6 years of war. While they hadn't lost any territory since the early days of the conflict, they had endured years of British occupation, inflation, loss of life, and foreign entanglements. And even though France was sending over supplies, The American people were growing weary of fighting a war that had lasted longer than any of them had expected. With both sides exhausted and neither able to achieve a decisive victory, peace talks became inevitable. But the question was, who was going to make the first move? Well, that's actually an easy question, because that honor goes to the British. As I said in the last video, Britain was completely tapped out by this war. They had already spent over £100 million on military operations in America, and they didn't want to spend another penny if they didn't have to. So, even though the British government knew that they couldn't officially negotiate with the Americans, they sent secret feelers to American leaders to test the waters and see if they were interested in ending the war. But while the British were making these feelers, another interesting thing was happening, and that was the American public's growing weariness of the war. See, by 1781, the American public was feeling pretty burnt out by the conflict. After years of fighting, they were ready to move on with their lives. And they weren't even that interested in independence anymore. In fact, a survey conducted in Massachusetts found that out of 164 men asked whether they would prefer independence, statehood within the empire, or increased representation in Parliament, 60 chose statehood, 42 chose independence, and 22 chose increased representation. This finding was pretty typical throughout the colonies, and it presented a real problem for the American leadership. If they wanted to keep fighting for independence, they needed to convince the American people that it was worth the cost in blood and treasure. But with so many people just wanting the war to be over, how are they supposed to do that? Well, the answer actually came from an unlikely source. France. See, while the British were making peace feelers to the Americans, the French were doing the exact same thing to the British, and that meant that the Americans were suddenly holding all the cards in any potential negotiations. In fact, the French were so confident that they were willing to offer the British an extremely generous peace deal, one that included granting the British West Florida and granting them freedom of the Mississippi River. And even though that was a great deal for the British, they refused to accept it. Why? Well, because they didn't want to seem weak. If they accepted a peace deal with the French, it would look like they were surrendering in the face of defeat, and that would be terrible for morale back home. This is actually a really interesting part of the war because it shows just how important perception was to the outcome of the conflict. Both sides knew that they were exhausted, and neither side wanted to admit that they were ready to give up. Instead, they both wanted the other side to make the first move, so that they could appear strong and decisive. The British hoped that the Americans would jump at the chance for peace, while the Americans hoped that the French would push the British into accepting a favorable peace deal, and neither side was disappointed. The Americans took the peace feelers from the British as a sign of weakness and decided to hold out for a better deal. And the British couldn't believe their luck when the French offered them such generous terms. So with the two sides unwilling to talk peace, it seemed like the conflict would drag on indefinitely. That is, until a young lieutenant colonel named Banastre Tarleton changed everything. Okay, click here to keep watching. And thanks for watching. This is the host with the American Revolution podcast, and this is Chapter 2 of the Secret History of the American Revolution. For those of you listening in the year 2023, this episode was originally published as 2 separate episodes, so there will be 2 parts to this chapter. Today we're going to cover pages 27 through 46. Which includes chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the book. If you're just joining us for the first time, welcome. And if you're a long-time listener, welcome back. We are so glad that you're here. Before we get into the chapter, I want to remind everyone that my book, The Secret History of the American Revolution, is available now from our website. I will also post a link to it in the description below. It's filled with all kinds of secret, surprising, and lesser-known stories about the American Revolution, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Just a quick reminder before we dive right into the chapter. So let's get into Chapter 2. Why negotiations were necessary. After the Battle of Monmouth, things were looking pretty good for the Americans, but as they settled in for the winter, they realized that they were going to have a serious problem feeding and supplying their troops. Congress knew that they needed to bring Washington and his army into Philadelphia, but they couldn't afford to do that until they had taken some steps to supply them. In order to do that, they decided they needed to open negotiations with Britain and find out what they would need to do in order to end the war. While Washington's army was camped near Morristown, New Jersey, they were becoming increasingly restless. Officers and soldiers alike were thinking about leaving the army, and not just because of the harsh winter weather. Congress was unpaying its soldiers, and the army was slowly being depleted by men whose enlistments were expiring. And while Americans were clamoring for more involvement in the war, most of them weren't willing to leave their homes unless they were absolutely necessary. This lack of support forced Washington to keep his army in camp, instead of moving them to Philadelphia where they could hopefully forage for food. But this was difficult, too, since the locals in New Jersey were struggling to feed themselves. As Colonel John Nixon wrote home, "The distress of the people in this quarter is great, and the little produce they have raised is consumed by the British parties who occupy the towns and the highways." As you can imagine, with all of these hardships on both sides of the conflict, both the Americans and the British were ready to begin talking about ending the war. Across the Atlantic, the British public was growing tired of the war, especially after the costly Battle of Monmouth. The British Parliament saw this coming and wanted to make one last effort to end the war before the Americans took over. The British government sent Lord North back to Britain to negotiate peace with the Americans. While he waited for his ship to arrive, he stopped in Halifax to speak with General Sir Henry Clinton. Lord North presented the general with 3 options. No. 1. Invade the southern colonies and try to take Charleston. Or number 2. Take control of the Great Lakes region by capturing Detroit, Montreal, and Niagara Falls. Or finally, option no. 3. Try to capture New York City. Of these 3 options, Clinton thought option no. 3 was the best. He believed that the southern colonies were well defended and taking Charleston would be nearly impossible. He also thought that the northern plan was doomed because it required him to split his forces. He proposed to Lord North that he should lead an invasion into New York. Since he believed that the vast majority of American troops were in the South, he thought that he could easily capture New York City and then march south to finish off the war. Meanwhile, when Lord North arrived in Philadelphia, he found that the Continental Congress had already left the city. They had fled north to avoid the British invasion force. While North was searching for the members of Congress, General Washington was doing the same thing. But Washington was also trying to figure out how he was going to keep his army together long enough to stop the British takeover of New York. Even though Congress had fled, Lord North was able to locate some members and ask them his 3 questions regarding independence. First, he asked if they would settle for anything less than independence. To this, they replied, no. Independence was the only thing that they were fighting for. They wouldn't settle for anything less. Next, he asked if they would accept a reconciliation with the king. They told Lord North that they would be willing to meet with the king, but they didn't want to offer up any promises beforehand. Finally, he asked them if they would allow the king to keep his power over the colonies. If the colonies were to become independent, again, the answer was no. Independence meant independence, and nothing less. At this point, Lord North realized that the goal of ending the war without granting independence was impossible. He tried one last time to convince them otherwise, but after his failure, he packed his things and headed north to meet with General Clinton and discuss the situation. Upon meeting with Lord North, General Clinton immediately suspected that the negotiations had failed. He knew that if the talks were successful, Congress would have granted at least some concessions. But since they hadn't moved to New York, Clinton knew that they were still holding out. When he asked Lord North what had happened, he replied, "I am sorry to say that we have not been able to effect any kind of reconciliation. One must therefore, in a few days, set sail for England. You will have the goodness, I know, to put yourself at the head of the army and proceed to the attack of New York." Lord North then departed, leaving Clinton in charge of ending the war once and for all. Clinton wasted no time in getting his plan started. He knew that he had only one chance at this, and he had to succeed. On August, he led his troops north and began his march on New York. This was a massive invasion force consisting of 8,000 regular troops, 100 commissioned officers, and 400 seamen. With him, he carried letters of marque giving him authority to confiscate any American shipping and merchant vessels that he came across. In order to understand what happens next, we need to travel south to the mouth of the Hudson River, where a small group of Americans were defending against a British naval blockade. These defenders were led by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Knox, and their job was to make sure that British ships did not enter the Hudson River. This was important, because British troops could sail up the Hudson and surprise the Americans. But the Americans needed to be able to use the Hudson to transport goods and supplies to New York. On September 2nd, 1779, Knox received word that a large fleet of British ships was approaching the mouth of the Hudson. Even though the Americans were outnumbered, they prepared for battle. Knox placed cannons along the banks of the Hudson and waited for the British to approach. As soon as the British ships were within range, he ordered the cannons to fire. A shot from one of the American cannons hit the HMS Roebuck, causing it to catch on fire and eventually sink. The other American ships were also damaged, but none of them sank. After recovering from the attack, Knox immediately wrote to George Washington, informing him that the British fleet was trapped. In his letter, he said, "We have fought the enemy's fleet this morning and have beat them. 2 ships have gone down, and the rest have retreated with a spanking. I can't tell you the particulars without a particular journal. Can only say that the cannonading was dreadful. Their fleet consists of 7 sail of a line, 2 of which are 64 guns. Our loss is inconsiderable. The enemy must have suffered severely. Nothing can exceed the confusion of the whole fleet. They came out of the Sound in single file, and the leading ship fell into the fort's mouth, and then the whole line suffered." Knox ended the letter by saying that he was sending someone ahead with the news to make sure. Washington got the message as soon as possible. With the help of a fast-sailing schooner, Washington received the news just 3 days later on September 5th. Upon reading the news of Clinton's defeat, Washington was ecstatic. He immediately called for volunteers to join Knox in the fight, and he planned for the rest of the army to follow. And that's the end of part 1 of this chapter. Next week, we'll pick up in part 2, where we'll learn how the British attempted to escape from New York and how the Americans pursued them all the way to Canada. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel. We're on our way to 100,000 subscribers, and we'd love to have you join us. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to pick up your copy of my book, The Secret History of the American Revolution, from our website. Until next time, remember, America, you're never too far from independence. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the Treaty of Paris. Last time, we focused on the tense negotiations between Britain and the newly formed United States. But here's the thing. The American Revolution wasn't just a 2-player game. It was a global chess match with multiple powerful nations moving pieces across the board. In this chapter, we're zooming out to look at the crucial international dimension, exploring the roles of France, Spain, and Holland. In shaping the final piece, this wasn't just about American independence. It was about redrawing the map of global power. So, grab your seat at the negotiating table, because things are about to get complicated. The Treaty of Paris wasn't one single document, but a collection of agreements. Why? Because America wasn't Britain's only problem. The most significant player, without a doubt, was France. Remember the Battle of Saratoga. That American victory was the turning point that convinced King Louis XVI to officially back the American cause. In 1778, France signed a treaty of alliance with the colonies. This wasn't just a friendly handshake. It was a formal military pact. French soldiers, sailors, and, most importantly, the French Navy were instrumental in securing American victory, especially at the final showdown in Yorktown. Without the French fleet blockading the coast, Cornwallis might have been resupplied or escaped, and the outcome could have been very different. So, when peace talks began, France was at the table with its own set of interests, and they were legally bound to the Americans. One of the key terms of their 1778 alliance was that neither France nor America would make a separate peace with Great Britain. They had to stick together. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, was the master puppeteer of these negotiations. His primary goal wasn't just American independence. It was to weaken his lifelong rival, Great Britain. He wanted to see Britain humbled, its empire diminished, and its global prestige shattered. This shared goal created a powerful bond between the French and American negotiators, but it also created friction. The Americans, led by pragmatists like John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, were eager to secure their own interests. They started to suspect that Vergennes might be willing to sacrifice certain American ambitions like expansive western territories or fishing rights off Newfoundland if it meant achieving a broader French objective or appeasing another one of his allies. This led to a fascinating and risky diplomatic maneuver. The American delegates, technically violating their agreement with France, began holding secret, separate talks directly with the British. They gambled that they could get a better deal for America by negotiating one-on-one, and then present the preliminary treaty to the French as a done deal. It was a bold move that could have backfired spectacularly, but it ultimately paid off for the United States. Now, let's bring another major European power into the mix. Spain. Spain joined the war against Britain in 1779, but here's a crucial distinction. They allied with France, not directly with the United States. Spain was deeply suspicious of the American Revolution. The Spanish monarchy, with its own vast colonial empire in the Americas, was terrified that the idea of republicanism and independence might spread to its own territories. Can you imagine the King of Spain helping a group of rebels break away from their king? It was a dangerous precedent. So, why did they join the fight? Simple: opportunity and revenge. They saw a chance to reclaim territories lost to Britain in previous wars. Their number one prize? Gibraltar, this tiny rocky outpost at the southern tip of Spain, controlling access to the Mediterranean, had been a British possession since 1713. For Spain, its capture was a matter of national honor and strategic necessity. They poured immense resources into a massive, multi-year siege of Gibraltar, known as the Great Siege. Alongside Gibraltar, Spain had its eyes on retaking Florida, which Britain had acquired after the 7 Years' War, and controlling navigation rights on the Mississippi River. These ambitions put them in direct conflict with the Americans, who were also looking to expand westward and southward. This created a major headache for the French diplomat. He was caught in the middle, trying to satisfy his Spanish allies, who wanted to limit American westward expansion, while also supporting his American allies, who saw that same land as their birthright. The Spanish were adamant about keeping the Americans pinned east of the Appalachian Mountains. They even proposed creating a neutral Indian buffer state in the Ohio Valley, which would have been under Spanish protection. This idea was, of course, a non-starter for the expansionist Americans. The conflicting claims over the Mississippi River and the southern boundary of the United States became some of the most contentious points of the entire peace process, often pitting the Allies against each other more than against the British. Finally, we have the Dutch Republic, or the Netherlands. The Dutch role was primarily economic and naval. For much of the war, they tried to remain neutral. As one of Europe's leading trading and banking nations, they profited handsomely by selling supplies to all sides, especially the Americans and the French. The Caribbean island of Sint Eustatius, a Dutch colony, became a vital hub for smuggling weapons, gunpowder, and other essential goods to the American revolutionaries. It was basically the Amazon warehouse of the revolution. This shadow trade infuriated the British, who saw the Dutch as directly fueling the rebellion. The breaking point came in 1780. Britain discovered a secret draft treaty of commerce and friendship between the Dutch and the Americans. Enraged, Britain declared war on the Dutch Republic, kicking off what's known as the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. This was a disaster for the Dutch. Their navy was no match for Britain's Royal Navy, and their global trade empire was suddenly vulnerable. The British quickly captured many Dutch colonies and crippled their shipping lanes. By the time the peace negotiations in Paris were underway, the Dutch were in a very weak position. They were there to basically cut their losses. Their main goal was to regain their captured territories and restore their trading rights. They didn't have the leverage of France or Spain, but their involvement underscores how the American conflict had spiraled into a world war, drawing in nations based on old rivalries and economic interests. So, as we can see, the Treaty of Paris was far more than a simple divorce between Britain and America. It was a multilateral diplomatic ballet, choreographed by Francis Vergennes, with each nation dancing to the tune of its own ambitions. France wanted to humble Britain. Spain wanted to reclaim lost glory and territory, especially Gibraltar. The Dutch wanted to repair their shattered economy, and the Americans, caught in this web of European intrigue, had to skillfully navigate these competing interests to forge their own destiny. It was this complex interplay of alliances, rivalries, and secret dealings that ultimately shaped the world that emerged from the American Revolution. Thank you so much for joining us for this crucial chapter. It really shows how interconnected the world was, even back in the 18th century. If you're enjoying this series and learning something new, Please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll dive into the final terms of the treaty and its lasting legacy. We'll see you next time. Chapter 4. Choosing the American Negotiators. So in the last episode, the Continental Congress had declared independence, and now it is time for the United States to send some negotiators to Europe to persuade the European powers to support their new nation. But who should they send? Who were the best men to represent the United States in this first critical test of diplomacy? Let's find out. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Henry Lawrence. 4 very different men who would come together to form one of the most successful negotiating teams in history. It is July 8th, 1776, and the Continental Congress has just declared independence from the British Empire. Now the hard work begins of getting the new nation recognized by foreign powers. So, naturally, the next order of business is to choose the men who will be the first to represent the United States overseas as diplomats. In a unanimous vote, the Continental Congress appoints John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Henry Lawrence. 4 commissioners for peace to go to Europe and begin the difficult task of persuading the European powers that the American Revolution is a just cause that is worthy of their support. And so these 4 men set off for Europe to represent the brand new United States. But how did these men come to be chosen? Why them, and why now? Well, let's start with John Adams. John Adams was born in Massachusetts Bay on October 30th, 1735. By trade, he was a lawyer, but throughout his adult life, he has been a leader in the movement for independence from the British Empire. While many people think of Thomas Jefferson as being the author of the Declaration of Independence, it was actually John Adams who pushed the most for its adoption. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress from Massachusetts, and it was he who made the motion to declare independence on June 7, 1776. Then when the vote was taken 2 days later, it was John Adams who made sure that the 13 colonies officially became the United States. After the declaration, John Adams served on the committee to draft the Articles of Confederation, which would serve as the first constitution of the new nation. He also served on the committee to draft the first Navy Bill, which established the Continental Navy, which allowed the United States to have a fighting chance against the British Navy. And before leaving for Europe, John Adams was appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States, where he became the first Chief Justice of the nation. With his legal mind, his passion for freedom, and his deep knowledge of the arguments for independence, John Adams was an obvious choice for the Commission for Peace. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston on January 17, 1706. Like John Adams, he had long been a leader in the movement for independence. Unlike John Adams, he was not a politician, but rather a writer and printer. His most famous publication was Poor Richard's Almanac, which he published every year from 1732 to 1758. It was filled with wit and wisdom that helped make Franklin famous in the colonies. Franklin was also one of the founders of the University of Pennsylvania and the first Postmaster General of the United States. In addition, Franklin was also a scientist. He discovered the concept of positive and negative electricity, and he invented the lightning rod. But perhaps Franklin's greatest claim to fame was his role in the American Revolution. As a member of the Continental Congress, he was one of the 5 members of the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. And during the war, he was a delegate to France, where he secured the vital French alliance that allowed the Americans to win the war. So when it came time to choose the American commissioners, there was no better choice than Benjamin Franklin. John Jay was born on December 12, 1745, in New York City. Like John Adams, he was a lawyer by trade, and like Benjamin Franklin, he was a writer. Indeed, much of Jay's early career was spent as a journalist. In fact, he was the editor of a pro-independence newspaper called the New York Weekly Journal. This led him to become the attorney for the New York Chamber of Commerce, where his opposition to British policies gained him recognition that led him to become a delegate to the Continental Congress, where he represented New York from 1778 to 1789. There he played a key role in writing the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolutionary War. Jay was also one of the 5 men who drafted the Declaration of Independence, and after the war, he went on to serve as the first Chief Justice of the United States. So, clearly, John Jay was a good choice for the Commission for Peace. Finally, there was Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence was born on June 25, 1723 in South Carolina. He was the son of a wealthy landowner and plantation owner. This gave him great wealth and a privileged life. In fact, he inherited over 700 acres of land in what is today downtown Charleston, South Carolina. Like the other three, he got involved in politics and served as a member of the South Carolina legislature from 1758 to 1765. During this time, he worked to improve education in South Carolina and founded the first public library in Charleston. However, as the road to independence grew more clear, Lawrence shifted his focus to independence. He was elected as a delegate to the Continental Congress, and while there he supported the call for independence. In fact, he voted in favor of both the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. After the war, he was appointed to the Commission for Peace, where his job would be to get the King of Sweden to support the United States. Little did he know that his life was about to change forever. And so these four very different men would come together to form the Commission for Peace. They were very different men with different backgrounds and experiences. John Adams was the fiery idealist, Benjamin Franklin, the wise pragmatist, John Jay, the intellectual moderate, and Henry Lawrence, the wealthy Southerner. But despite their differences, they shared a common goal: winning recognition for the new nation. When John Adams received his appointment to the Commission for Peace, he was not pleased. He had hoped to stay in America and continue to fight for independence, but he knew that his skills could be put to good use in Europe. So he set off for France, where he would meet up with the rest of the commission. Upon arriving in Paris, Adams wasted no time in getting to work. He began writing letters to key figures in France, including King Louis XVI and the influential Duc de Ch. In these letters, Adams laid out the case for American independence and asked for their support. Meanwhile, Franklin and Jay set about the task of securing French financial support for the war effort. They knew that the French would not go to war with Britain to help the Americans, but they could provide much-needed financial assistance that would help the Americans win the war. After all, the main reason that the French had fought the 7 Years' War was to gain North American territory. In the end, they had lost Canada and were bitter about it, and so if they could persuade the Americans to give the French territory in exchange for money, then it seemed like a pretty good deal. Eventually, they agreed to provide loans totaling 5 million livres. While this was not as much money as the Americans had hoped for, it was still enough to keep the war effort afloat. Henry Lawrence, meanwhile, went to Sweden. But when he arrived, he was told that the king was out hunting and would not be able to see him for several days. So Lawrence decided to take advantage of the situation and toured the city of Stockholm. While there, he met a number of influential people, including King Gustavus III. When the king returned from his hunting trip, Lawrence paid him a visit and began laying out the case for American independence. He argued that the American colonies were a natural market for Swedish goods, and that a close relationship between the two nations would be mutually beneficial. Ultimately, Lawrence was successful in persuading the king to sign a trade agreement with the United States. So there we have it. The four men chosen to represent the new nation in Europe were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Henry Lawrence. They were very different men with different backgrounds and experiences, but they shared a common goal: winning recognition for the new nation. Each of them played an important role in the Commission for Peace, and each of them helped to secure recognition for the United States. I hope you enjoyed learning about the American negotiators. If you did, please be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you want to learn more about the American Revolution, be sure to check out the series on my channel. Thanks for watching. All right, welcome to another episode of Crash Course AP Government and Politics. In this episode, we're going to look at Chapter 5 of your textbook, which is entitled The Venue of Peace, Paris. So, if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so before we dive into the details of the peace negotiations that took place in Paris, why don't we begin with an answer to the why Paris question that every time you start a new unit you should be asking. And the answer to that question is simply that Paris was chosen as the venue for these peace negotiations because it was considered a neutral location. That is, neither Britain nor America could claim it as their own, and it was far enough away from both places that any attacks would take some time to get there. Now, that might seem obvious today given that Paris is in France, but keep in mind that back in the 18th century, France was not a significant world power. They had been weakened by the French and Indian War and were kind of biding their time until Napoleon came along. So, yeah, nobody really cared about defending France. So Paris, it was But besides being geographically central and therefore acceptable to both sides, Paris was also culturally central in terms of ideas. You see, in the 18th century, Paris was the capital of what was called the Enlightenment, a philosophical movement that emphasized reason, individualism, and democratic ideals. And so, since many of the founding fathers had been influenced by Enlightenment thinkers, they felt right at home in Paris. Furthermore, Paris was home to many salons, which were basically social gatherings, where influential people could discuss politics and culture in relative privacy. This was important because much of the discussions surrounding the peace negotiations took place outside of formal meetings between diplomats, and because it allowed for the spread of American ideas about government back in the colonies. Finally, Paris was a city with a lot of diplomatic experience, having served as the site of many international congresses or meetings. So all of those things made Paris a great location for the American Victory Party. But there was one more thing, and that was the widespread popularity of Benjamin Franklin. Now, Franklin had traveled to France on a diplomatic mission several years earlier, and he had become quite popular there, largely due to his wit and folksy charm, but also because of his reputation as an American hero. So when word got around that Franklin would be returning to Paris as part of the peace delegation, crowds of enthusiastic French citizens showed up at his lodgings to greet him. So obviously, all of that stuff made Paris a great choice for hosting the peace negotiations. But once there was up in, well, after spending 2 years in relative peace, war broke out again in 1778, with the French joining the conflict, and that led to the following. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the main topic of this chapter, which is the peace negotiations between Britain and America. So, first off, as you could probably imagine, the British came to the table with a lot of demands, like, hey, we started this war over a dispute about taxation, and now we re-saying that we will not impose any new taxes on the colonies without their consent. So clearly, we're being reasonable here. Not imposing new taxes was definitely a concession to America, but it wasn't exactly like Britain was offering America the moon. After all, there was still all sorts of restrictions on trade and manufacturing in the proposed British plan for governing the colonies. And maybe, most importantly, Britain wanted to keep control of the Ohio Valley, which was something that America just couldn't accept. After all, if America were to cede the Ohio Valley to Britain, then Britain would have a land route to the Mississippi River, which would effectively give them a monopoly on trade with the Western tribes. And that was something that Americans felt would threaten the security of the Western states. So although the British offered some pretty significant concessions regarding taxes, the sticking point in the negotiations was the issue of representation. Like Britain insisted that Americans had to be represented in Parliament before they could vote on any taxes. And that's not exactly how the Founding Fathers viewed things. As John Adams explained, we ought to be very jealous of representation, that we suffer not ourselves to be represented in the British Parliament. We may justly fear the influence of such representation on our present and future interest. No act of a delegated authority comes to me with stronger claims than that of the voice of the people. In other words, Americans did not want to be represented in Parliament. They wanted to be represented by people who were elected by the people. So ultimately no agreement could be reached and the peace talks fell apart. And then something unexpected happened. The French decided that they didn't want to keep fighting, so they made a separate peace deal with the British, which left the Americans free to fight another day.
Okay, so that raises the question, why did the French suddenly decide to make peace with the British?
Well, there are a couple reasons. First of all, the French realized that they couldn't beat the British militarily, and so they were eager to stop fighting and focus on other theaters of war in Asia and Africa. But second, and perhaps more importantly, the French were willing to sacrifice America in order to get revenge against the British. And that brings us to the 7 Years' War. So if you want to learn about how the American Revolution became part of a larger global conflict, then click right over here. And you know what? While you're over there, if you want to help keep this channel afloat, then click on that subscribe button. Okay, so now that we've talked about the peace negotiations between Britain and America, let us finish this episode by talking about the impact that the war had on the relationship between the northern and southern states. So, during the war, the northern states raised money by taxing their citizens, while the southern states sold bonds to wealthy planters. And that meant that by the end of the war, the northern states were deeply in debt, while the southern states had a lot of cash. And that caused some tension when it came time to pay for the expenses of the war. But the real source of tension between the North and the South after the war was slavery. See, while the southern states had sent more men to fight in the war effort, the northern states had contributed more money, and that caused some resentment among southerners who felt that northerners were trying to use the war as a way to end slavery. For example, northern states like Pennsylvania refused to admit the entry of Vermont as a slave state, which angered southerners who argued that it was unfair for northern states to tell them how to govern. And those tensions came to a head at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So if you want to learn about how those tensions were eventually overcome, then click right over here. Okay, so thanks for watching. If you want me to keep making these videos, then by all means subscribe, and I'll see you next time. So today we're looking at Chapter 6, Britain's Representatives and Attitudes. This is, of course, part of our complete study guide for ACRGCSE, Religious Conflicts, in depth, but you can find more information below. Okay, let's get into the chapter. So as we saw in the last video, by 1913, there were growing tensions between the main world powers. And so as the French and the British were meeting together in Paris, trying to find some sort of solution to their colonial conflicts, this was all happening against the backdrop of increasing political pressure from within the two countries. And this is what we're going to look at in this chapter. So first of all, we have British representatives. Now, it's really important that you know a few key people for this period. First of all, we have Richard Oswald, who is also known as Lord Cromer. He was an aristocrat, and he was Britain's agent in Egypt. He was pro-Zionist, and he wanted closer ties with Arab leaders. But he believed that those ties could only be established if there was a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so, like the British government, he tried to play both sides off against each other, thinking that they might come to an agreement. Then we have Sir Henry McMahon, who was a British diplomat, and he was Britain's High Commissioner in Jerusalem. He had a very negative view of the Jews living in Palestine and thought that they were a troublesome race, and he was nervous about their increasing numbers. And then finally, we have Herbert Samuel, who was Britain's first Jewish member of Parliament. He strongly supported Zionism, and so he would have been someone who might advocate for a Jewish state. Now, one of the things that you need to consider for this question is, why did Britain feel compelled to acquire colonies? Well, simply put, it was because they were seeking empire. They wanted to compete with other European powers, such as France and Germany. They wanted raw materials and new markets for their goods. And finally, they were hoping to spread British culture and values around the world. For example, they felt that they had a duty to Christianize the world, and so all of these factors led Britain to become an imperial power. However, having said that, by 1914, there was growing war fatigue. There had already been the Second Boer War in South Africa, which had taken place over a long period of time. It had not been cheap, and it had actually damaged Britain's reputation. And so many people back in Britain were actually calling for the country to start cutting its imperial cloth according to its economic means. In other words, if it could no longer afford to keep an empire, then it should give some of it up. Furthermore, as we'll see in a later chapter, Britain was also fighting against the Ottomans, who controlled Palestine at the time. And again, this was proving to be quite costly. And so there was definitely growing sentiment in Britain that the country should seek some kind of accommodation with the Ottoman authorities, and perhaps even allow them to rule over their own people. Finally, Britain also felt pressured by its own domestic politics. So there were different political parties with different views on empire. The Liberal Party, for example, was generally more opposed to empire and certainly did not want to expand it any further, whereas the Conservatives were more in favor of maintaining and even expanding the empire. And so as a result of this pressure, any decisions that the government made about how to deal with Palestine would have to take into account these differing views. In addition to this, as we've seen in previous videos, there were a number of different groups in Britain who had an interest in Palestine. The first was the Zionist movement, which, as we've seen, began in the late 19th century as a response to anti-Semitism in Europe. Its main purpose was to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which was seen as the ancestral home of the Jewish people. Many Zionists were motivated by a desire to escape persecution in Europe, as well as a wish to contribute to the cultural and spiritual revival of the Jewish people. They were also attracted by the economic opportunities presented by a country that was rapidly being developed. And so as a result of all of this, by 1914, Derry Were, over 80,000 Jews living in Palestine. The second group was the Arab nationalist movement, AS. Wevi. Shin. Arabs had lived in Palestine for many centuries, and they too had their own cultural and religious sites which were holy to them. And so the Arab nationalist movement was concerned to protect these sites, and also to resist Jewish immigration to Palestine. The third group was the non-Jewish religious groups, which included Christians and Samaritans. And they had lived in the region for many centuries. They feared that if there was a Jewish state established in Palestine, then it might be at their expense. The fourth group was the Turkish authorities, which ruled over Palestine at the time, and they were suspicious of any attempts to undermine their authority. Finally, the fifth group was the British government, which, as we've seen, had acquired control of Palestine after defeating the Ottomans in battle. And they were keen to maintain order in the region whilst also trying to balance the interests of all of the groups that we've mentioned. Okay, so now let's move on to the French. Now, as you can probably imagine, the French representatives in the region were very similar to the British representatives. That is to say, there were individuals with differing opinions and beliefs who all needed to be taken into consideration when making decisions. So first of all, we have General Hubert Lyautey. He was a military leader and he was the French general in Morocco. He had a very positive view of Islam, and he was sympathetic to Arab nationalism. He sought to work with the Arabs in order to bring them into the French colonial project. Then we have Louis Vincent, who was a French diplomat and he was the French consul general in Jerusalem. He was nervous about the growing influence of the Jews in Palestine and he feared that they would become a threat to the stability of the region. Finally, we have Georges Picot, who was a French diplomat and he was involved in secret negotiations with the British over the future of the Middle East. He was in favor of French control over Syria and British control over Palestine. Now, the French had initially come to Palestine via their North African colony of Algeria. They had pushed southwards through the Sahara Desert, and they had begun to explore the area around Tunis and eventually set up an outpost there. However, they soon realized that they needed allies in order to push further south, and so they turned to the Arabs. Now, although the French had a long history of being suspicious of the Arabs, believing that they were uncivilized and backwards, they recognized that they needed their help. And so, as a result of this, General Hubert Lyautey sought to win the Arabs over by promoting religious tolerance, and also by introducing some modern ideas and institutions. He built schools, hospitals, and roads, and he also appointed Arabs to positions of power, and so gradually he won over the majority of the Arab population. However, despite this, there was still a significant minority who remained suspicious of the French, and this was mainly because they feared that the French would try to convert them to Christianity, exploit their resources, and also try to change their way of life. As we'll see in a later chapter, the French also faced opposition from the German Empire. The Germans had been exploring the possibility of building a railway line through Arabia, and they hoped that this would enable them to exert influence over the region. The French, of course, were very keen to prevent this from happening, and so they decided to make an agreement with the British to divide up the Middle East between them. This was known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So as we can see, there were lots of different groups with lots of different interests in Palestine and the surrounding area. And so it's important to remember that it wasn't just religious differences that were causing conflict. It was also about political and economic rivalries. Now what you need to do in your exam is explain how far religion had been a factor in the conflict. And so what you need to do is analyze how far religious differences had contributed to the tensions in the region. And then you need to evaluate how far other factors had contributed. In other words, you need to explain how far religious differences were the main cause of the conflict, or whether there were other factors which were more important. Okay. That's everything you need for this chapter. In the next video, we're going to look at the final chapter for this unit, which is Chapter 7, The Road to War. So I'll see you in that video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we witnessed the stunning victory at Yorktown, a moment that felt like the final curtain call for the British. But as we'll see today, the end of the fighting doesn't always mean the end of the war. The battlefield now shifts from muddy trenches to the gilded rooms of European diplomacy, and the next fight is for the soul of the new nation itself. So, picture this. The news of Yorktown hits London like a bombshell. The British public is war-weary. The treasury is empty, and Parliament is in an uproar. A new government comes to power, one that finally accepts the writing on the wall. America is lost. Their priority now, to cut their losses and make peace. But not just any peace. They want a peace that drives a wedge between America and its powerful ally, France. Opening parties, the American peace commissioners are assembled: Benjamin Franklin, the universally admired elder statesman; John Adams, the fiery and often stubborn New Englander; and John Jay, a brilliant but deeply cautious lawyer from New York. They have one clear instruction from the Continental Congress: do nothing without the knowledge and consent of our French allies. After all, France had been their lifeline, providing money, troops, and a navy. It was a matter of honor and treaty obligation. But as the negotiations begin to take shape, John Jay starts to get a bad feeling. He's a man who trusts his gut, and his gut is telling him that something is off. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, seems to be dragging his feet. He's evasive, his promises are vague, and he seems more interested in balancing power in Europe than in securing a strong, independent America. Why? Well, France had its own agenda. Vergennes was also juggling a treaty with Spain, and Spain had its eyes on territories in America, particularly Gibraltar and the vast lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Jay starts connecting the dots. If France is committed to helping Spain, and Spain wants to limit American expansion, then isn't France, by extension, working against American interests? He notices secret meetings, whispers in the hallways. He suspects Vergennes might be willing to trade away American claims to the Western Territories, or fishing rights off Newfoundland, just to satisfy Spain and bring the wider European conflict to a quicker end. For Jay, this wasn't just a suspicion. It felt like a betrayal waiting to happen. The alliance that had won the war could now be the very thing that crippled the peace. This is where the drama really heats up. Jay believes that following Congress's instructions to the letter, France on every single move would be disastrous. He sees it as walking into a trap. He turns to his colleagues. John Adams, who never really trusted the French aristocracy to begin with, is quick to agree. He sees the French court as a nest of intrigue and believes America needs to stand on its own 2 feet. The real challenge is convincing Benjamin Franklin. Franklin is the ultimate diplomat. He has a deep personal relationship with Vergennes and a genuine affection for France. He's also a pragmatist who understands the importance of honoring alliances. He initially hesitates, arguing that breaking their instructions from Congress is a dangerous and disrespectful move. It would be a slap in the face to the French king who had risked so much for their cause. The debate between the commissioners is intense. It's a clash of personalities and philosophies. Jay's suspicion versus Franklin's trust, Adams's blunt realism versus Franklin's diplomatic grace. This is the critical balancing act. On one hand, you have the alliance with France, the moral and legal obligation to a partner who helped them win. On the other hand, you have the fundamental goal of the revolution: true, uncompromised independence. Not just independence from Britain, but the freedom to chart their own course, to control their own borders, and to secure a future for their citizens. What good was winning the war if they were just going to become a pawn in France's great European chess game? Ultimately, Jay's persuasive arguments, combined with Adams's support, begin to sway Franklin. Perhaps it was Franklin's own shrewd understanding of human nature, but he finally agrees to a risky, clandestine strategy. They would violate their instructions in order to obey the true spirit of their mission. What does this mean? It means they decide to open a separate, secret line of negotiation directly with the British. This is a massive gamble. If it fails, they could be disowned by their own government. If the French find out, the alliance could shatter, leaving America isolated and vulnerable. The British negotiator, Richard Oswald, is delighted. This is exactly what his government had hoped for. By dealing with the Americans alone, they can offer more generous terms and peel them away from the French. The secret talks begin, away from the watchful eyes of Jay and Adams lay out America's non-negotiable demands. Absolute independence, the removal of all British troops, and, crucially, vast territorial claims. They don't just want the 13 colonies. They want the entire territory east of the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes, and south to Florida. The British, eager to finalize a deal and put the war behind them, are surprisingly receptive. They see a strong America as a valuable future trading partner and a buffer against French and Spanish influence in the New World. They concede on the borders, granting the new United States a territory that instantly doubles its size. They also grant generous fishing rights off the Canadian coast, a vital issue for New England's economy. The pieces of a preliminary treaty start falling into place, all while the French are kept in the dark. This secret maneuvering is one of the most audacious diplomatic gambles in history. It was a move born of suspicion and a fierce desire for self. The American commissioners were essentially defining what their independence would mean. In practice, would they be a minor nation, hemmed in and dependent on the whims of European powers? Or would they be a continental republic, with room to grow and the power to control their own destiny? By choosing to negotiate alone, they chose the latter. Once they had a draft of the treaty, the Americans were faced with their next challenge: how to break the news to the French. It was Franklin, the master of charm and diplomacy, who took on the delicate task. He went to Vergennes, admitted they had bent their instructions, and presented the terms of the preliminary treaty. He framed it not as a betrayal, but as a success that was achieved more quickly than would have been possible through the formal, complex, joint negotiations. How did Vergennes react? We'll dive into that French reaction and the dramatic final signing of the Treaty of Paris in our next episode. This secret chapter of diplomacy was just as crucial as any battle, securing not just peace, but the very shape and future of the United States. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this dive into the secret world of revolutionary diplomacy interesting, please hit that like button. And do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the conclusion to this incredible story. We'll see you next time. Alright, so now it's time for Chapter 8 of our Louisiana Purchase series. And in this episode, we are going to talk about how in the world they decided where the borders of this massive land deal were gone. Now, before we get into the episode, let me just take a second and say that we have got some very exciting news to share with you guys. So make sure you stick around until the end of the episode so you can hear all about it. Alright, so as you probably already know, one of the biggest issues facing the United States in 1803 was what to do about this Louisiana territory that they had just purchased from France. Like, they didn't even really know exactly where their borders were yet. They didn't know whether or not they had title to any of the surrounding areas, and there was no way they could effectively govern it without first knowing exactly where it began and ended. So in order to solve this problem, President Thomas Jefferson brought in a group of experts to help him figure out where the boundaries should be. Now, the group was headed up by two very important people, Attorney General Levi Lincoln and Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. But there was also a bunch of other folks in there too, like explorers, cartographers, scientists, diplomats, that sort of thing. So it wasn't like Jefferson just put this issue in the hands of two guys and hoped for the best. He assembled a pretty qualified team to help him figure it out. And when I say that these men had a tough job ahead of them, I am not kidding. There is a reason why establishing boundaries in 1803 was such a huge undertaking, because the simple fact was that nobody knew where the boundaries were supposed to be. Not even the French knew where the boundaries were supposed to be. So if the US wanted to change any of the boundaries, it would basically be up to them to figure out where they wanted to put them. And to do that, they needed to understand the various claims made by different countries. One of the biggest debates that they had to settle was the western boundary, and here is why that was so difficult. See, when Napoleon offered to sell Louisiana to the United States, he told President Jefferson that the western boundary would either be the Mississippi River or the eastern boundary of the Arkansas Territory, whichever was farther west. Now, those two things actually weren't all that far apart. Like, the Arkansas Territory only extended to the foothills of the Rockies, whereas the Mississippi River emptied into the Gulf of Mexico. So it wasn't that big of a difference. Still, though it was a massive difference, especially by the standards of the early 19th century. Like, are we talking about the entire Mississippi River? Because that would be an absolute king's ransom worth of land. Or are we talking about the eastern border of the Arkansas Territory? Because that would be a lot less land. The good news, though, was that there was a pretty obvious and well-established boundary that everybody agreed upon. The Mississippi River And so that is what President Jefferson's team used as the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. Then there was the northern boundary. This one was kind of a weird situation because at the time nobody really had any claims to the land north of the United States, except for, of course, the British and the Canadians. Most Americans assumed that the northern boundary would be somewhere around the Canadian border, but it wasn't clear on exactly where. Some people thought it should be the Ohio River, while others thought it should be the Missouri River, and still others thought it should be something in between those two rivers. Then, of course, you had to consider the British claims as well, which further complicated the matter. But again, thankfully, this situation was made much easier by the fact that there was an internationally recognized boundary between the United States and British Canada. That boundary happened to be along the 49th parallel, and that was established during the American Revolutionary War. So that's the one they went with. The northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase would be along the 49th parallel. Then, finally, there was the southern boundary. And this one was undifficult at all because the southern border of the Louisiana Purchase was simply going to be the northern border of Spanish Florida. And so now we have a pretty good idea of where the borders of the Louisiana Purchase were going to be. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle that needed to be solved, and that was Britain. See, while everyone agreed that the northern border would be along the 49th parallel, no one was really sure whether or not Britain would agree to that. In theory, the 49th parallel would give the United States everything they had ever claimed in the region, but it might also cause a war with Britain. So before the United States could set the official boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase, they needed to know where Britain stood. If they weren't willing to negotiate, then the U.S. might need to come up with a different plan. Thankfully, though, this wasn't nearly as big of an issue as everyone expected it to be. You see, back in 1783, when the United States and Britain signed the Treaty of Paris, they agreed to set up a commission to survey the boundary along the 49th parallel. Well, they never did that. And so there was always this little gray area between the United States and British Canada along the northern border. Technically, neither country knew where the border was. They both just assumed that it was somewhere along the 49th parallel. So when the United States asked Britain if they would officially recognize the 49th parallel as the boundary between the Louisiana Purchase and British Canada, Britain said yes. Now, this was definitely a surprise for the United States. No one was expecting Britain to concede so quickly. Least of all, President Jefferson. But it gave the United States the final piece of the puzzle they needed to set the borders of the Louisiana Purchase. And so ultimately, the Louisiana Purchase would be bordered on the west by the Mississippi River, on the north by the 49th parallel, and on the south by the 33rd parallel. Now, as you can probably imagine, telling everyone that the United States had gained all this land caused quite the stir down in Mexico City. Like, the Louisiana Purchase reduced the amount of territory that Mexico had claimed by over half, and they were none too happy about it. In fact, just to prove that point, we're gonna spend next week looking at the Mexican perspective on the Louisiana Purchase and how in the world they went from claiming all of this land to just this little sliver of Texas. It's gonna be a good time. So with all that said, I'm gonna go ahead and bring this episode to a close. But before I do, I want to tell you guys about that exciting news we teased you with at the beginning of the episode. See? We have been working on a documentary about the Louisiana Purchase for a while now. We've interviewed tons of historians. We've traveled all over the region, and we have a rough cut of the documentary that is absolutely incredible. Like, if you guys have been enjoying this series, the documentary will blow your mind. But in order to finish it and share it with the world, we need a little bit of help. So we launched a Kickstarter campaign, and the response has been absolutely amazing. And so that means that we are still offering rewards like the digital download and the physical DVD. We're also still offering the handwritten letter and the custom map. And if we reach our final stretch goal, then we'll even do a live Q&A session on another platform. So if you guys have the means and you want to help us finish this documentary, it would mean the world to us if you would go over to Kickstarter and check out our campaign. With that said, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Alright, welcome back to my channel and another video on Mr. Beast style Canadian history. Now, before we get started, I just want to say a special thank you to our newest member. Thanks so much for joining. And if you are interested in joining as well, the link is down below. We've got some pretty sick perks, like a secret bonus podcast access to our server and your name at the end of every video. Anyway, today we're going to be looking at Chapter 9, Fishing Rights and Economic Freedom. So, let's get into it. Okay, first things first. We've got a map here that outlines all of the fishing rights in North America. Now, these are not all of the fishing rights, but they are important for this video. Notice how the British colonies in North America have very little access to the Grand Banks of Terra Nova, or, as we now call it, Newfoundland, which is absolutely insane because those fishing banks were discovered by John Cabot, who was a Venetian explorer sailing on behalf of the English. Also, the Portuguese had no claim to the Grand Banks, even though they are right there. Why did they get them? Well, because the Portuguese were Catholic, and the Spanish were Catholic, and the French were Catholic, and they were allies and friends, and they divided up territories based on where they found them. But the British and the Spanish were sworn enemies. They were fighting an undeclared war in the Caribbean and the Atlantic at the moment. So the British weren't about to go sharing their newfound fishing grounds with the Spanish. But why do they care so much about these fishing rights? Well, it's because of how important fishing was to the economy. See, since the beginning of time, humans have fished, and humans will fish until the end of time. It's one of the oldest forms of sustenance and, more importantly, trade in the world. In the North Atlantic, specifically off the coast of Newfoundland, there was so much fish that the entire economy of Newfoundland could be run off of it. Fish was dried, salted, and sent to Europe for a profit. This was especially true during Lent, when Catholics couldn't eat meat, so they needed a protein source. And for centuries, cod was king. Okay, so at the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the British came to an agreement with the Portuguese that would give them exclusive fishing rights to the Grand Banks, which was awesome. But then came the American Revolution, which meant that the British now owned all of the fishing rights off of the eastern coast of North America, except for the one little area right there that they gave to the Americans as part of the Treaty of Paris. Now, there was nothing about this that said anything about controlling the land. All it said was that they had fishing rights. This is going to be really important later. But while this treaty might have been good for the Americans and the British, it was bad for the French because it took away all of their access to the Grand Banks. And that's not good because, again, fishing is super important. But the French had bigger problems to worry about, like literally losing all of their land in North America, except for some small islands and a little slice of Quebec over here. But anyway, moving forward to 1818, we can see that the British and the Americans were having issues over the fishing rights. The Americans felt that they had exclusive rights to the Grand Banks because the Treaty of Paris said that they had fishing rights, which technically wasn't false, but it didn't specify what that meant exactly. The British, however, thought that they still had fishing rights because they had exploration rights because John Cabot was English, and that what the Portuguese treaty said exploration rights. So the Americans and the British each claimed the Grand Banks and everything went to the courts. Unfortunately, the court case dragged on for 14 years, and neither side wanted to wait that long for a decision, so they decided to make a deal. In 1827, the British and the Americans met together to negotiate the fisheries, and they agreed that the Americans would have full access to the Grand Banks, but in return the British would get all of the saw logs and timber that the Americans harvested in the Pacific Northwest. And then in 1855, the Americans sold their fishing rights to the British for $1 million, because the Americans were going through a lot of stuff at the time. They had abolished slavery, so now they had former slaves to take care of. They were also trying to settle the Oregon question with the British, and finally, they were about to start the Civil War. So they figured that they didn't really need this whole fishing thing anymore. But again, this deal was a bit shady because the Americans didn't actually own the fishing rights to begin with. They only had access to them. They didn't own them outright. So how were they able to sell them? Well, they couldn't. But here's the thing. Since the British didn't actually have any way of enforcing their fishing rights, the Americans basically had de facto control of the Grand Banks anyway, because nobody else could use them. So in reality, the Americans sold the British the right to something that they already had access to. Now, this is probably a really confusing mess of jargon and legalese that nobody really understands. But basically, what this means is that the British now had complete control over the fishing rights of the Grand Banks. And this was very important for the British colony of Newfoundland. You see, the people of Newfoundland were almost entirely dependent on the fish. They ate it themselves. They exported it. Their economy relied heavily on it. And the fact that the British now had complete control over the fish in the sea basically meant that they controlled the colony. This dependence on the fish led to a lot of economic issues, because whenever there was a surplus of fish, prices would crash and people would lose money. But when there was a shortage, the price of fish would skyrocket and everyone would be forced to pay higher prices. But the worst part about all of this is that the Newfoundlanders had no control over the fish. They were completely at the mercy of the fish gods. If the fish gods were angry, then the Newfoundlanders would starve. Now, this was obviously a huge issue. People needed to be able to feed themselves. They needed to have a stable food supply. Otherwise, chaos would ensue. So in 1929, the Newfoundlanders proposed a new system that would regulate the amount of fish being caught so that they would not be at the mercy of the fish gods anymore. This was called the Total Allowable Catch, or TAC. And it was essentially a quota system. Each boat would be given a certain amount of fish that they could catch, and once they hit that limit, they couldn't catch anymore. Now this sounds like a great idea, in theory, but in practice it meant that people were relying on the government to tell them how much fish they were allowed to catch so that they could survive. And that's not always a good thing. It essentially meant that the government could control the economy of the region simply by changing how many fish they allowed fishermen to catch. But there was hope, because the Newfoundlanders were promised that if they joined the Canadian Confederation, they would keep their economic freedom, their language, and their religion. But if you've been paying attention, you might remember that the British had a history of taking away things that they had promised not to. And boy, were you right. In 1934, the Great Depression had hit Newfoundland hard, and their economy was in sharp decline. So they asked the Canadian government for a loan of $12 million to help rebuild their economy. And while the Canadians agreed to lend them the money, they had an ulterior motive. See, they told the Newfoundlanders that in order to get the loan, they would have to give up their economic freedom and allow the Canadians to control their tariffs. Now, this wasn't a big deal at first. The tariffs weren't really a problem. But then in 1952, the Americans lowered their tariffs as part of a larger trade deal that they were making with the rest of the Americas. And this caused a huge issue for the Newfoundlanders, because now Canadian goods could flow into Newfoundland without tariffs. But Newfoundland goods had to have tariffs put on them when they went into Canada. This meant that soon Newfoundland was buying more from Canada than they were selling to Canada. And this caused a huge uproar among the people of Newfoundland. They were furious because the Canadians had lied to them. They promised them that they would keep their economic freedom if they joined Confederation, but they were breaking that promise. So in 1953, the Newfoundlanders held a vote to decide whether or not they should leave the Canadian Confederation, and 70% voted to stay. So that is the story of Chapter 9, Fishing Rights and Economic Freedom. I hope you learned something. I know this was a pretty weird chapter and it kind of jumped around a lot, but it is really important to understand how the British and the Americans got their land and why the Americans sold their fishing rights to the British. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you want to watch more, feel free to but as always, I will see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. We've celebrated the victory, the birth of a new nation, but what about those who didn't want independence? What happened to the thousands of Americans who remained loyal to the British Crown? Their story is one of the most complex and often overlooked chapters of the Revolution, a messy tale of broken promises, confiscated fortunes, and a deep-seated tension between the ideals of reconciliation and the thirst for punishment. Let's set the stage. Imagine living through the Revolution. Your neighbors, maybe even your family, are swept up in the patriot cause, but you believe in the stability of the British Empire. You see the rebels as dangerous radicals. For you, loyalty isn't a political choice. It's a fundamental part of your identity. These people were called Loyalists, or Tories, and they came from every walk of life: wealthy merchants, humble farmers, recent immigrants, and established colonial elites. It's estimated that about 20% of the white colonial population, nearly 500,000 people, were Loyalists. During the war, life for them was incredibly difficult. They faced public humiliation, boycotts, and violence. Many were forced to sign oaths of allegiance to the new state governments. If they refused, they could be stripped of their right to vote, hold office, or even practice their profession. As the war progressed, the measures became harsher. states began passing laws to seize the property of known Loyalists. Why? Two main reasons. First, it was a way to punish those seen as traitors who are actively aiding the British. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the new, cash-strapped American governments needed money to fund the war effort. Confiscating Loyalist estates' land, homes, businesses, was a quick way to raise revenue. These confiscation acts were sweeping. If a Loyalist fled to British-controlled territory or joined the British Army, their property was often declared forfeit. State commissioners would inventory everything from sprawling plantations in the South to modest shops in New England and sell it all at public auction. Patriots, often those with political connections or the means to buy, snapped up these properties, sometimes at bargain prices. This process not only funded the war, but also dramatically reshaped local economies and social hierarchies, transferring wealth and power from the old Loyalist elite to a new patriot class. For the Loyalists, this was devastating. They lost everything they had built, sometimes over generations. Many had also extended credit to their patriot neighbors before the war. These debts, owed asterisk to asterisk the Loyalists, were often nullified by the new state governments. So, not only was their property taken, but the money they were owed simply vanished. They were financially and socially ruined. This brings us to the end of the war and the Treaty of Paris in 1783. This was the moment of truth. What would the peace treaty say about the Loyalists? The British negotiators, led by men like Richard Oswald, felt a profound sense of duty to protect the people who had sacrificed everything for the crown. They pushed hard for two key provisions concerning the Loyalists. First, they wanted a complete halt to any further confiscations and prosecutions against Loyalists. Second, and most critically, they demanded the restitution of all estates, rights, and properties that had been seized. In simple terms, they wanted America to give everything back. This was a major sticking point in the negotiations. The American delegates, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, knew this was a political bombshell. Think about it from their perspective. The states had already sold off these properties. The new owners were patriots, the very people who had fought and won the war. Forcing them to return the land to the traitors they had just defeated was politically impossible. It would cause outrage, and the weak central government under the Articles of Confederation had no real power to compel the individual states to comply anyway. So, a compromise was reached, and it's found in Articles 5 and 6 of the treaty. Article 6 was fairly clear. It promised an end to future confiscations and prosecutions. But Article 5, the one dealing with property restitution, was deliberately weak. It stated that Congress would earnestly recommend to the state legislatures that they restore the confiscated property. Earnestly recommend. That's it. There was no enforcement mechanism, no requirement, no penalty for ignoring it. It was a suggestion, and everyone at the negotiating table, both British and American, knew it was a hollow promise. As you can imagine, the states almost universally ignored the recommendation. The animosity towards Loyalists was still incredibly high. Mobs often gathered to prevent returning Loyalists from even setting foot in their old towns. State governments, facing immense pressure from their citizens, had no political will to enforce Article 5. A few states made token gestures, but for the vast majority of Loyalists, their property was gone for good. There would be no going home, no reclaiming their former lives. This failure to secure restitution left tens of thousands of Loyalists in a desperate situation. Around 60,000 to 80,000 of them became refugees, fleeing the United States. They went to Britain, to the Caribbean, and most famously, to the remaining British colonies in North America, particularly what is now Canada. Entire communities were established by these displaced people in places like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Ontario, where they became known as the United Empire Loyalists. They were the political refugees of America's first Civil War. So, what about compensation? If the Americans wouldn't pay, would the British? Yes, to an extent. The British government, feeling a moral obligation, established the Loyalist Claims Commission in 1783. This was a remarkable effort to systematically investigate and compensate Loyalists for their losses. Claimants had to travel to London or special commissions in Canada to present their case. They had to provide detailed inventories of their lost property, along with witnesses and documents to prove their loyalty and the value of their claims. Over several years, the Commission reviewed thousands of claims, totaling millions of pounds sterling. While claimants rarely received the full value of what they had lost, the British government did pay out a substantial sum of form of reparations for those who had kept their allegiance. It was an acknowledgement of their sacrifice, but it could never fully replace the homes, communities, and sense of belonging they had lost forever. The story of the Loyalists and their property is a stark reminder that the founding of the United States was not a simple, heroic tale. It was also a story of deep division, of winners and losers, and of painful choices. The conflict between reconciliation and punishment, between legal ideals and popular anger, shaped the nation's early years. The empty promise of restitution in the Treaty of Paris reveals the practical limits of diplomacy in the raw, emotional aftermath of a revolution. It's a messy, human story that complicates our understanding of American independence. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into a crucial, yet often forgotten, part of our history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe for more content, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next chapter. Well, hey there. Welcome to my history channel. And here we are in chapter 11, which is titled Native Nations, with a subheading and the treaty's blind spots. And that treaty, of course, is the Northwest Ordinance. So we're going to be looking at how Native Americans weren't really part of the discussion when it came to this ordinance, and how it affected them in the long run. So let's get started. Okay, let's start off with a big fat map. This is a map of the Ohio Valley showing the land claims of various Native American tribes and nations. And then we have some more. These are the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. And then down here, the Choctaw Cherokee, Chickasaw and Creek nations. Now, why am I showing you all of these maps? Because if you look closely, you will see that much of this territory that we've been talking about in this course, the territory that's being organized into the Northwest Territory, well, it's not empty. It's filled with Native American nations who have their own governments, their own cultures, their own histories. And yet, as we read in this chapter, they had no voice in the decisions made by the United States government regarding their lands. So what happened? How did this exclusion come to be? Well, there are many factors, but one of them is simply that people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the drafters of the Northwest Ordinance, didn't really think of Native Americans as equals. They had a paternalistic view of Native Americans. They thought that they could help Native Americans, but Native Americans couldn't really help themselves. And so they thought they were the superiors and needed to guide these so-called savages into the right direction. And ultimately, that meant removal. That's what it meant. It meant that Native Americans should be moved off of their lands to make room for white settlement. In addition to that, the states that bordered the Northwest Territory didn't want to deal with multiple governments within the region. They wanted clear and undisputed authority over the land. And finally, the United States was at war with many of these Native American nations. So needless to say, they weren't exactly sitting at the negotiating table. But this exclusion would have huge consequences. Now, we've already talked a lot about how the Northwest Ordinance opened up the Northwest Territory to white settlement. And this process began almost immediately after the ordinance was passed in 1787. The first wave of settlers headed into the territory and began to establish communities. We're talking about places like the Miami Valley and the Upper Allegheny River Valley. And as they moved in, they brought with them their ideas about land ownership, and that led to conflict. You see, for most Native American nations, the concept of owning land was very different than it was for European Americans. For most Native American nations, the idea of land ownership was communal. Land was owned by the tribe as a whole, and individuals within the tribe had the right to use the land, but they didn't have the right to sell it. For European Americans, however, land was seen as a commodity. It was something that could be bought and sold, and it could be used as collateral for loans. In other words, it was an economic asset, and that clashed, obviously, with the Native American way of thinking. For example, in the Ohio Valley, the Miami and the Delaware had hunting grounds that they used for thousands of years. It was part of their culture, part of their way of life. But when European Americans moved into the area, they began to see these lands as property, and they began to fence it off and hunt on it in ways that the Native Americans didn't like. In addition, settlers began to push into Native American territories, and they did things like build roads and survey land, and that really disrupted Native American life. Like for the Miami, the process of surveying land was very upsetting to them. You see, the surveyors were laying out these grid patterns on the land, and that seemed to the Miami to be very disrespectful, because it was in their view disrespectful to lay such a grid over the graves of their ancestors. Then there was the issue of refugees. As the United States expanded westward, many Native Americans were forced to flee their homes and seek refuge on lands west of the Mississippi River. And they wanted to go there because they had treaties with various tribes out west that guaranteed them the right of refuge. But the United States wasn't really interested in honoring those treaties because, again, they saw Native Americans as inferior, and they also saw them as an obstacle to progress. So the U.S. government tried to prevent Native Americans from entering the Northwest Territory. And this created a major crisis for the refugees. Like, for example, the Shawnee Chief Bluejacket. He appealed to the British for help. He said, "Our lands are taken from us without our consent. Our lives are hunted down by your merciless allies, and we are refused an asylum in the country of the Western tribes, our only remaining hope." And unfortunately for Native Americans, the British weren't interested in helping them either. See, in the Northwest Territory, there were two competing claims on the land, the American claim and the British claim. And the British weren't about to prioritize Native Americans over their own interest in the region. And this lack of support really put Native Americans in a precarious position. They were caught between a rock and a hard place. They were caught between two powerful European nations that neither one was interested in protecting their rights or their sovereignty. And then there was the issue of slavery. You know, when the Northwest Territory was being organized, the question of slavery was a big point of contention between the northern and southern states. And the Northwest Ordinance ended up creating a territory that was free of slavery. However, the ordinance didn't do anything to protect the freedom of Native Americans. In fact, it did just the opposite. The ordinance actually encouraged slavery among Native Americans. Let me explain. See, when the United States acquired the Northwest Territory, they paid for it by taking land from Native Americans. And sometimes that land was acquired through treaties, but other times it was acquired through force, like during the Revolutionary War. And when Native Americans were forced to move onto reservations, they often brought their slaves with them. But the Northwest Ordinance allowed for slavery in the Northwest Territory, so long as the territory was a slave state. And that meant that Native Americans who brought their slaves with them could keep them. But if they were free, well, then the ordinance didn't protect them. So you can imagine that, for Native Americans, this was a very difficult situation to be in. Like, for example, the Choctaw Nation. They had about 2,000 enslaved people living within their borders. But the United States didn't recognize any of this. They just assumed that all of the land in the Northwest Territory was empty. So when the Choctaw were forced to move onto reservations, the U.S. government didn't count their enslaved people as part of their population. Instead, they counted the Choctaw as 3/5 of a nation. So you can imagine that this caused a lot of resentment and anger among Native Americans. They felt that they were being treated unfairly and that their rights were being violated. And this would lead to future conflicts between Native Americans and the United States government. But for now, we're going to wrap up this video. If you want to learn more about the conflicts between Native Americans and the United States government, please check out my course on the American Revolution. I talk about it in great detail there. Also, if you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy some of my others. And thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Bye. The year is 1782, and the American Revolutionary War is over. At least it's over here in America. But in Europe, where all the important people are, well, they're still haggling over who gets to be on the winning side. In Tia Series, we cover events leading up to the signing of the U.S. Constitution. And in our last episode, we saw the Continental Congress debate whether to accept the British offer to end the war. Now we pick up their story as they draft and sign the treaty that ends the Revolutionary War. So it's November 30th, 1782. The members of the Continental Congress have voted to accept the terms of the preliminary articles with Great Britain. It seems like everyone is pretty pleased with themselves. John Adams says, "This is a glorious day and may it be a happy one for the United States." But now what happens? Well, now they have to wait for the king to ratify the agreement, which he won't do until September 1783. You see, While the preliminary articles officially ended the hostilities between Britain and America, it was basically an IOU for peace. Think of it like when your mom tells you that she is gone, not pay you for your chores later, but you know that later never comes. Well, in this case, the only way that the preliminary articles became a real treaty ending the Revolutionary War once and for all was when both countries signed and ratified the final treaty. So everyone kind of went home and waited. Now, while this might have been disappointing for the Americans, who were eager to start repairing the damage done during the war, at least they knew that peace had been secured. Not so for our friends across the pond. See, before peace could be declared in America, the other European nations had to finish their own peace deals with Britain. France and Spain needed to finalize their treaties first, because they were still at war with Britain over their own colonial holdings. As it turned out, these negotiations dragged on and on. The French were angry that the British had broken the alliance between the two countries by making a secret peace deal with some of the Iroquois tribes in the Ohio Valley, and they wanted something symbolic to show that the British had ceded territory back to them. So Britain offered to give them part of this region, as well as a couple of islands off the coast of Africa. And that wasn't good enough for the French. They also wanted a chunk of the island of Mina. This was unacceptable to the British, who counteroffered with a few small islands near mainland Britain. This went on for months. Then there was Spain, who had a much longer list of grievances against the British. They demanded the return of Gibraltar, which the British had seized in 1704 during the War of the Spanish Succession. But the British were in no mood to give back any of their hard-won conquests, and so refused. The Spaniards then tried demanding the Bahamas, as well as the disputed territory of Florida. Again, the British said no. This time, they were willing to give the Spanish a tiny slice of East Florida around the city of St. Augustine, but not the whole enchilada. But even as these negotiations continued into the summer of 1783, the Americans didn't know it. Or if they did, they thought it was just a formality. But as June rolled by without a ratified treaty, rumors started spreading throughout the colonies that perhaps the king had changed his mind and the peace deal was off. Remember, it was common knowledge that the preliminary articles had been signed, and people were starting to get pretty excited about the prospect of peace. But when news arrived that it was being delayed, the public got nervous. In Boston, townspeople gathered together to discuss the possibility that King George might renege on the deal and restart the war. On June 26, a group of veterans wrote a letter to the Congress, asking them to take action. "We understand the treaty is not yet definitively concluded, nor the preliminaries finally determined," they wrote, "and we cannot but consider with anxiety the possible event of its being broken off. If such should happen, we shall find ourselves without a sovereign, without a king or country, without a home. We shall be a nation without government and laws, exposed to the hostile attempts of our enemies abroad, and the cruel persecution of our merciless fellow subjects in Britain." Yeah, we'll say that the situation was getting pretty dire. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the British Parliament was also starting to get antsy about the whole situation. As early as February 1783, Lord North's government had to fend off an attack of no confidence from Charles Watson, who believed that the government was conceding too much to the Americans. Watson wanted to give them only independence between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and no more. That way, he argued, the British could still maintain a valuable empire in Canada. But he was defeated. However, by May, things had gotten so bad that Northwest government felt compelled to release a statement explaining why the treaty was taking so long. "It has been observed," they said, "that the preliminary articles have been published in America and have gone through the press. His Majesty is advised and has declared that, though the said articles have been published in America and the copies thereof printed and dispersed there, they are not to be considered otherwise than as a secret for the present between the two crowns." Basically, they were trying to walk back the publication of the preliminary articles, saying that it was all a big mistake. But it was too late. The damage had already been done, and unfortunately, this was all just a preview of what was to come. To learn how the Americans and the British eventually came to finish the treaty and end the Revolutionary War once and for all, check out Chapter 30 of our podcast, which you can listen to right now. Okay, so the American public is starting to get anxious about the delay in ratifying the treaty. And the British government is coming out and saying that maybe they re not gonna honor the deal after all. Are the Americans about to go back to war of courseth? Nah, this is a period drama, after all. But how did the peace deal ultimately get finished? Well, Let us take a look at the situation from the perspective of the man who played a critical role in bringing it all together, John Adams. Like many New Englanders, Adams was a merchant by trade, and the war had devastated his finances. He lost money when the British occupied Philadelphia and used his house as a barracks. Then he lost more money when his ship, the Boston, blew up, trying to unload gunpowder in France. Finally, when he went to Europe to help negotiate the peace deal, his wife Abigail had to mortgage their home to keep it from being seized by creditors. So you can imagine that Adams was very eager to bring the war to an end and collect whatever debts he was owed. But he soon discovered that his fellow negotiators weren't nearly as enthusiastic. John Jay, for instance, had traveled all the way from New York to Paris with his wife and 5 children, and he was having a great time gallivanting around the French capital. When news arrived that the preliminary articles had been leaked, Jay reportedly threw a fit and blamed Adams for rushing the negotiations and causing the delay. Benjamin Franklin, meanwhile, was busy playing the role of elder statesman and having a grand old time hobnobbing with kings and popes. In fact, he was so beloved in France that the streets literally ran wine when he left. Even the British commissioners seemed pleased with the outcome of the talks, except for one, David Hartley. You see, while the war had been going on, Hartley had served on committees of the British government that supplied intelligence to Loyalist leaders, and he was hoping that with a little bit of arm twisting, he could convince the Americans to leave room for restoring the monarchy in America. But as soon as the preliminary articles were announced, those hopes were dashed. As far as Hartley was concerned, the Americans were adamant about becoming their own republic, and he was outnumbered on the commission. Still, Hartley would prove to be a thorn in the side of the American negotiators, frequently complaining that the peace deal was too favorable to the Americans. Nevertheless, when the full text of the treaty arrived in Paris from London for the American commissioners to sign, they did so without a hitch. John Adams would later write, "I put my pen to the first page of the definitive treaty of peace between Great Britain and the United States, and the last stroke of my pen was on the 8th day of September 1783, the most memorable day in the history of America." But while Adams and his colleagues were celebrating, things weren't going nearly as smoothly in America. You see, one of the provisions of the peace treaty was that the United States would assume all the debts incurred by the states during the war, debts that had been issued to encourage men to join the military-built ships or supply food and ammunition. But now that peace had been declared, the people who had lent money to the states were understandably looking for a way to get it back. The problem was, not all the states were on board. In particular, Virginia was furious about the provision, claiming that it would bankrupt the state and cause great misery to thousands of its citizens. Governor Thomas Jefferson threatened to throw himself into the river rather than allow the debt assumption to pass. But ultimately, he and the other governors would relent, thanks in no small part to the argument that, without the assumption of debts, it was unlikely that foreign nations would make loans to the new United States. That, of course, led to another problem. See, the national government didn't actually have the power to assume debts incurred by the states, because according to the Articles of Confederation, the central government had no authority over state governments. So to work around this, James Madison proposed a compromise, creating a federal government that would assume all the states' debts and establish a national bank to pay them back. In exchange, the states would give up their individual power to tax, leaving the collection of taxes to the national government. And thus, the stage was set for the creation of a much more powerful national government than the one outlined in the Articles of Confederation. To learn more about how this struggle over state versus federal power culminated in the creation of our modern constitutional republic, check out our series, available now wherever you get your podcasts. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey through the American Revolution. We've weathered the harsh winters at Valley Forge, celebrated the stunning victory at Yorktown, and now we arrive at the final, crucial chapter, the diplomatic triumph that officially birthed the United States of America. Today, we're diving deep into the definitive Treaty of Paris. After the cannons fell silent at Yorktown, the war wasn't technically over. A fragile peace existed, but the future of the 13 colonies hung in the balance. The real battle shifted from the muddy fields of North America to the opulent drawing rooms of Paris. This was a high-stakes game of diplomacy, with the fate of a new nation resting on the shoulders of its negotiators. Representing America were 3 brilliant minds: Benjamin, John Adams, and John Jay. Each brought a unique strength to the table. Franklin, the elder statesman, was a master of charm and diplomacy in the French court. Adams, ever the pragmatist, was direct and uncompromising. And Jay, a skilled lawyer, was deeply suspicious of European intentions, particularly those of France and Spain. Their British counterpart was David Hartley, a member of Parliament and a friend of Benjamin Franklin. This personal connection was helpful, but the negotiations were far from simple. The American team had been instructed by Congress to coordinate closely with their French allies. However, John Jay quickly realized that France and its ally Spain had their own agendas. France wanted to keep America weak and dependent, while Spain had its eyes set on territories like Gibraltar and lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Recognizing this, Jay convinced his colleagues that they needed to negotiate directly and secretly with the British. It was a bold and risky move that went against their official orders, but it proved to be a match. This independent approach allowed the Americans to secure incredibly favorable terms. They weren't just negotiating for peace. They were defining the very existence and future of their country. After months of intense back-and-forth, a preliminary treaty was signed in November 1782. But this was just the beginning. The final, definitive treaty needed to be hammered out, and it would take another 10 months of careful wording and political maneuvering before it was ready. And so we arrive at the momentous day, September 3rd, 1783. The setting was the Hotel de York in Paris, the residence of the British negotiator, David Hartley. The atmosphere must have been thick with anticipation. In that room, the representatives of a fledgling nation, born from rebellion, stood as equals with the delegates of the most powerful empire on earth. Imagine the weight of that moment. Years of bloodshed, sacrifice, and unwavering belief in the cause of liberty had all led to this. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay put their signatures on the document. David Hartley signed for King George III. With the stroke of a pen, the war was officially over. Now, let's break down what made this treaty so significant by looking at its key articles. Article 1 is perhaps the most powerful. It begins, His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States to be free, sovereign, and independent states. This was it. This was a sentence that changed everything. It wasn't just an end to hostilities. It was a formal recognition of American sovereignty by its former colonial ruler. The British Crown was officially letting go. This article alone validated the entire struggle and the principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence. Article 2 was almost as crucial, as it defined the borders of the new nation, and the terms were incredibly generous. The United States would extend from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west. Its northern border was established along the Great Lakes, and the southern border was set at the 31st parallel, just north of Florida. This effectively doubled the size of the original 13 colonies, giving the new nation a vast expanse of land for future growth and settlement. The British could have tried to restrict America to the Appalachian Mountains, as the French had hoped, but instead, they granted a continental-sized territory. This decision would shape the course of American expansion for the next century. Article 3 addressed another critical economic issue: fishing rights. For the New England colonies, the fishing industry, particularly off the coast of Newfoundland, was the lifeblood of their economy. John Adams, a proud Massachusetts man, fought tenaciously for this. The treaty granted American fishermen the liberty to fish in the Grand Banks and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, just as they had as British subjects. This was a major economic victory, ensuring the continued prosperity of the northern states. Of course, the treaty also had to address the messy aftermath of the war. Articles 4, 5, and 6 dealt with debts and the treatment of Loyalists, American colonists who had remained loyal to the British Crown. The treaty stipulated that creditors on both sides could recover their pre-war debts. This was a point of contention, but it was essential for re-establishing trade and financial trust. Article 5 was more complicated. It stated that the U.S. Congress would earnestly recommend to the state legislatures that they restore the rights and properties of Loyalists. The key phrase here is earnestly recommend. The weak central government, under the Articles of Confederation, couldn't force the states to comply, And in reality, many Loyalists faced continued persecution and never had their property returned. This article was more of a gesture to appease the British than a guaranteed protection for the Loyalists, many of whom ultimately fled to Canada or Britain. Finally, Article 7 called for the withdrawal of all British forces with all convenient speed. It also included a crucial, though often ignored, clause that the British would leave without carrying away any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. This was a significant point, as thousands of enslaved people had sought freedom behind British lines during the war. Despite this article, when the British evacuated cities like New York, they took thousands of these freedmen with them to Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, and England, refusing to return them to a life of bondage. When news of the signed treaty reached America, it was met with widespread celebration. Bells rang, bonfires were lit, and toasts were made to the new nation. It was the symbolic culmination of everything the Patriots had fought for. The signing of the Treaty of Paris wasn't just a document. It was the birth certificate of the United States of America. It represented a monumental shift in the global order. A colony had successfully revolted against its parent empire and established itself as a sovereign nation, recognized on the world stage. This moment was a powerful symbol that would inspire countless other independence movements around the globe for centuries to come. The idea that a people could determine their own destiny, free from the rule of a distant monarch, was no longer just a philosophical dream. It was a proven reality. The treaty marked the end of the American Revolution, but the beginning of the American experiment and ongoing journey to live up to the ideals of liberty and self-governance secured on that September day in Paris. It was the definitive end to the war and the definitive beginning of a nation. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the Treaty of Paris. It is a testament to the fact that wars are won not only on the battlefield but also at the negotiating table. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter in history. We'll see you next time. The year is 1918. World War I has finally come to an end. But just how did people around the world react to this news? Well, some were elated, while others felt nothing but dread. Today, we're going to find out how this conflict affected those across the pond in Europe and beyond. This is episode 138 of the World War I podcast. Our first stop takes us over to the United States, where celebrations erupted across the nation. New York City was one such location that saw hundreds of thousands take to the streets. Parades featuring American flags, banners reading, "Thank God the boys are coming home," and even a mock hearse carrying a coffin labeled Kaiser Bill made the rounds. In total, 122,000 U.S. soldiers would eventually return home from Europe, many of whom would go on to lead the parades themselves. President Woodrow Wilson addressed the crowds from his state. "We have done our share and more than our share, and now we can go down into history." Others echoed these sentiments. The New York Times proclaimed the war was over and victory was ours. For once, America had taken up arms for a righteous cause and won. The paper added that we can afford to be just a little bit tender toward the vanquished foe who has inflicted such terrible suffering on innocent civilians and soldiers. Many Americans felt the same way, with some even sympathizing with Germany. After all, the Central Powers had also suffered great losses during the conflict. Even still, few could deny the benefits the U.S. had gained by joining the Allied cause. Prior to the war, isolationism was the norm, with most Americans indifferent to the plight of Europe. Now their country was seen as a major player on the world stage. The president's 14 points had also provided a vision for a post-war world based on democracy, self-determination, and free trade. In short, America was at the cusp of a new era. But unfortunately, the same could not be said about Britain. While Londoners celebrated, they did so with a mixture of relief and bitterness. They realized that victory came at a great cost, especially when it came to their empire. Since the conflict began, Britain had been fighting to preserve its far-flung territories. The Germans had come close to achieving this goal, sinking thousands of British merchant ships and even invading Ireland. Had the conflict dragged on much longer, who knows what might have happened. Instead, the British could only look back on the sacrifices that had been made. Over 1 million British subjects had lost their lives. Whole communities were wiped out and food shortages became commonplace. The war had also strained relations between Britain and its colonies. Australia and New Zealand, for example, had been furious over Britain's failure to protect their interests in the Dardanelles. Going forward, these tensions would only grow, leading to the eventual dissolution of the British Empire. Across the Channel, the French felt similar emotions. Paris erupted in cheers as the armistice was announced, but many of them soon faded into bitter tears. Since the start of the war, the French had been subjected to 3 years of violence on German soil. Cities like Amiens and Verdun were devastated, while countless French families were broken apart. Despite the casualties, the French had fought valiantly alongside the British, and now it was time for them to claim victory. As one woman told the New York Times, "Vive la victoire. We are very happy. We have been waiting for years for it. It seems to me as if all the happiness of France is in this day." The true cost of the war would not be known for some time. By the end of hostilities, over 4 million French citizens would be dead, including nearly 1 million North African troops. Like Britain, France had also lost its empire. German forces had occupied a large portion of its colonial holdings. On top of these, French morale was beginning to turn against the elites who had sent them off to fight in the first place. As historian Margaret Macmillan noted, French society was broken and bleeding, and its political future was entirely uncertain. For many Europeans, the end of the war brought with it a sense of uncertainty. Their homelands had suffered greatly during the conflict, leaving many to wonder what the future held. In Berlin, the news was received with shock. For the past 4 years, the Germans had been fed propaganda that painted their army as invincible. To suddenly learn they had lost was a shock. People began to argue in the streets, with many blaming politicians and generals for making poor decisions. As one witness recalled, the general opinion seemed to be that it wasn't our fault, but somebody else's fault. There was no jubilation or other outward signs of excitement. There was a sort of stupor. No one knew what to say. Everyone was overwhelmed. Some Berliners, however, were secretly pleased with the outcome. For instance, Paul von Hindenburg was someone who believed Germany had done well in the war. He went on to say, "The result of the war is not a disgrace for us, even though we can no longer hold the positions which we formerly occupied." Similarly, many German nationalists argued that their country had not lost the war, but rather been denied victory. Historians have labeled this perspective the stab-in-the-back myth. According to it, Germany actually won on the battlefield, but was betrayed by those on the home front. To them, the true enemy was not France or Britain, but rather Jews, communists, and democratic socialists. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were mixed reactions. Those living in the Hungarian half of the empire were thrilled to see the back of their emperor, Charles IV. Ever since he took the throne, Charles had tried to transform the Austro-Hungarian monarchy into a democratic state. Unfortunately, his efforts were undone by his predecessor, who had sparked the war in the first place. With the collapse of the empire, Magyars could finally chart their own path to statehood. Across the Balkans, the Serbian people were also for the past 4 years, they had been fighting alongside the Allies against the Central Powers. With victory, the Serbs could look forward to creating a greater Serbia that would include Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia. Unfortunately, this proved easier said than done. Tensions quickly developed between Serbia and the newly formed Kingdom of Italy over control of the Adriatic coast. Then there were the Greeks, who had joined the conflict late in 1917. They too were celebrating, with many believing Greece would soon be entering into an era of prosperity. Unfortunately, their Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos had other plans. He wanted to expand Greece into the Ottoman Empire. Luckily for the rest of the region, this plan was soon thwarted. As for the Ottomans, their reaction to the armistice was one of relief. At the start of the conflict, they had been an ally of Germany and Austria. But after the Gallipoli disaster, they switched sides and joined the victorious Allies. Still, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed V had hoped to keep his empire intact. That was not to be. Soon after the fighting ended, representatives from Britain, France, and Russia met together at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference to discuss the fate of the Middle East. At the conference, Britain and France carved up the region amongst themselves. Much to the dismay of the Ottomans, finally, let's cross the sea and head over to Japan. Japanese leaders were quite satisfied with the outcome of the war. When they entered the conflict in 1914, their goal was simple: to seize German holdings in the Pacific. These included the Mariana Islands, Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. The Japanese had also coveted German East Asia, a region that encompassed modern-day Shandong province in China. With the end of hostilities, Japan now controlled all of these regions and more. The war had also boosted the Japanese economy. During the conflict, they supplied much-needed raw materials to their allies. And as a result, the Japanese yen was now the third most valuable currency in the world, behind only the pound and the dollar. For many Japanese, the war had proven to be a financial boon. The real losers, in the eyes of the Japanese, were the Russians. Before the war, Russia had blocked Japanese expansion in Korea and Manchuria. Now that they were gone, the Japanese were free to do as they pleased. So what started out as a local conflict in Europe had now become a worldwide phenomenon. The war had truly been a global event. To learn more about how the war impacted the home front, check out this playlist. To learn more about how the war started, check out this episode. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'll catch you next time. Welcome back to our final chapter. We've journeyed through the smoke of battle, the tension of negotiation, and now we stand at the dawn of a new nation. Today, we explore Chapter 15, the legacy of the Treaty of Paris. This isn't just an ending, it's the beginning of everything for the United States. How did a simple document, signed thousands of miles away, lay the foundation for the powerhouse we know today? The Treaty of Paris was more than just an official end to the Revolutionary War. It was the birth certificate of the United States. The most immediate and profound impact was the recognition of American independence. This wasn't a temporary truce. It was the world's greatest superpower, Great Britain, acknowledging that a new, sovereign nation had been born. This international legitimacy was crucial. It meant America could now enter into treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic relations with other countries as an equal, not as a rebellious colony. Think about the sheer scale of the land acquired. The treaty doubled the size of the original 13 colonies, granting the new nation all the territory east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of Canada. This immense expanse wasn't just empty land. It was a promise of westward expansion, of resources, of opportunities for millions. It set the stage for the manifest destiny of the 19th century and defined the geographical contours of the country for generations to come. This vast territory would become the heartland of America, fueling its economic growth and shaping its national character as a nation of pioneers and builders. It was a geographic destiny handed to the nation on a silver platter, a truly unprecedented acquisition of territory through diplomacy rather than conquest. But the legacy wasn't just about land and recognition. The treaty process itself taught the fledgling nation invaluable lessons. Imagine Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams in Paris. They were outmatched, representing a brand new country with a weak army and an empty treasury, negotiating with the seasoned diplomats of Europe. Yet, they succeeded. How? Through brilliant diplomacy, a keen understanding of their opponent's interests, and the difficult art of compromise. They learned that to get what you want, you sometimes have to give a little. For example, they agreed to honor pre-war debts owed to British merchants, and to recommend that states restore property to Loyalists. These were unpopular concessions back home, but they were necessary to secure the much larger prizes: independence and territory. This taught America a fundamental lesson in statecraft. Diplomacy is a dance of government. It established a precedent for pragmatic, interest-based foreign policy that would guide the nation through centuries of international challenges. It showed that a new nation could hold its own on the world stage, not just through force, but through intelligence, patience, and strategic negotiation. This brings us to the broader impact on international relations. The American Revolution and its successful conclusion sent shockwaves across the globe. It was a powerful demonstration that a colony could successfully rebel against its imperial master and establish a republic based on the consent of the governed. This inspired revolutionary movements in France, Latin America, and beyond. The Treaty of Paris wasn't just a bilateral agreement. It was a global event that signaled a shift in the world order. It challenged the very idea of empire and championed the principles of self-determination and popular sovereignty. America became, for many, a beacon of liberty, an experiment in democracy that the whole world was watching. Its success, cemented by the treaty, proved that the ideals of the Enlightenment weren't just philosophical musings. They could be the foundation of a real, functioning government. So, as we reflect on this journey, we see the profound arc from war to peace. The smoke is cleared from the battlefields of Lexington, Saratoga, and Yorktown. The passionate debates in Philadelphia have quieted, and in their place, a new nation is born, holding in its hands a treaty that is both a conclusion and a prologue. A conclusion to a long, arduous struggle for freedom, and a prologue to the story of the United States of America. The legacy of the treaty is all around us. It's in the map of the country, in its diplomatic traditions, and in the very idea of America as an independent nation. It was the moment a revolutionary cause became a geopolitical reality. The ink on that parchment in Paris may have dried over 2 centuries ago, but the nation it helped create continues to write its story, a story that began with the bold Declaration of Independence and was secured by the careful diplomacy of peace. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible historical journey. From the first shots fired to the final treaty signed, it's been an honor to explore this pivotal era with you. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what piece of this story fascinated you the most. Until next time, stay curious.